Is this world here by accident, a random product of time plus matter plus chance, or is this world here by the created and designed will of a loving Heavenly Father? One of my friends who's a doctoral student at a very prestigious school phoned me in a panic one day and said the opening day of his lecture, this professor looked at them across the class and he said, the goal of this class is to knock any idea of God that some of you may have within you. And if you happen to be a believer in God, you're better off getting up and walking out right now, because my course is designed to knock any idea of God within any one of your minds. It can happen either very seductively, it can happen in a very subtle way, or it can happen very brazenly. I can tell you something very plain here, and I want you to follow me. Listen carefully, please. The fact of the matter is that science has not disproved the existence of God. Science has not established naturalism as a justifiable posture for origins. You will read and find out again and again that which is espoused by atheists on university campuses who are professors espouse that atheism not because of the science that has led them to believe it, but because of a pre-commitment to a philosophy of life. This is the whole point that Philip Johnson, professor at Berkeley, makes in his books, Darwin on Trial and Reason in the Balance. He said there's an undergirding philosophy that drives the secular scientific worldview, where science is sort of made into that which it was never intended to be. Let me give you a couple of illustrations of this. I'd finished a series of lectures at Princeton University. The place was packed to capacity, and my whole talk was to challenge atheism and defend the Christian gospel. The questions were there in very hostile form and antagonistic form, and yet the students returned for lecture after lecture and applauded and received what was given. On that last night, one student stood up in front of this packed audience and he said this to me. He said, Mr. Zacharias, I brought two of my atheistic friends here last night for the lecture, and they had come prepared to challenge anything you'd said. As we were walking away, I said to one of them, why didn't you ask the questions you said you were going to ask? There was silence in the stillness of the night, and then he looked back at this Christian who'd invited them and said, the arguments were too persuasive to counter. And then he paused and said this, even though the arguments were too persuasive, I am still remaining a convinced atheist. He said, what do you have to say to my friend? I said it to him in the opening line of my lecture last night, that my goal is to try and demonstrate to you that if you are an atheist, it is not for intellectual reasons, but for moral reasons. There's a pre-commitment. Aldous Huxley in 1946 said this, I want this world not to have meaning. I want this world not to have meaning because it frees me to my own erotic pursuits. Think of all of the grandeur that God has poured into this universe, all of the specified complexity, the marvelous design that is there. Wasn't it not Carl Sagan, while he was still professor at Cornell, who made this astounding comment? He said, if we can get only one intelligent message from outer space, we'll know there is intelligent life out there. If we can get only one intelligent message. Did Carl Sagan not pause to think for a moment that one strand of human DNA has 600,000 pages of information? One strand of human DNA, 600,000 pages of information. Think of that. The marvelous design. We are living in a lonely world. We are living in a very needy world. Some of you may remember the name of Madeleine Murray O'Hair, the famed atheist, who has been missing for the past few years. Recently, her diaries were auctioned off. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of her diaries and her journal as an atheist. 3 times punctuated in these diaries were these words, will somebody somewhere please love me? Will somebody somewhere please love me? How do you feel that love as you graduate and leave here moving into other parts? I close now with this most fascinating story that is something that some of you may be familiar with because I have printed it in one of my books. The year was 1971. I was still doing my undergraduate in theology, and I was invited to speak in Vietnam. The war was still pretty heavy. A lot of killing was going on during those days. My interpreter was a 17-year-old young man. His name was Hien. Hien and I traveled across the length of Vietnam, all the way to the demilitarized zone. God, in an extraordinary way, use these two young lives in many, many settings to break in a revival in the land of Vietnam. We were in many U.S. Armed Forces bases. We were in prisoner of war camps. We were in military hospitals. Both of us were too young to have been in places like that. But God, in His sovereign grace, used our lives. At the end of the 4 months after I'd finished preaching in that land, I embraced Hien, not thinking if I would ever see him again. That was 1971. 17 years had gone by. In 1988, I received a telephone call. And it took me only a moment when he said, "Brother Ravi," on the phone, for me to recognize that I was talking to Hien. I said, "Hien, where are you calling from?" He said, "I'm calling you from Los Angeles." I said, "What are you doing in the United States? How did you get out of Vietnam?" He said, "Have you got a few minutes to listen to my story?" I said, "Yes, I have." He said, "Brother Ravi, after Vietnam fell to the north and to the Viet Cong, I was arrested and put into prison. And I was brainwashed. Every day I was being asked to read Marx and Engels. They were trying to knock faith in God out of my life. Marx and Engels every day. And I was not allowed to read anything in English because they were trying to cut me off from the West completely, saying the missionaries and all had poisoned my mind. They were breaking me away from all of this. French and Vietnamese, Marx and Engels, only Marxist ideology. It was just pouring in my mind. One day I was reading Engels' book describing a Marxist man caged by capitalism, and the Marxist man as a bird bashing away against those wires, trying to break free, bloodying itself in the process. But keep hitting, he says, keep hitting. Someday you will break those bars. He said, I went to bed that night and I thought to myself, God, are you only a figment of my imagination? Did the missionaries really brainwash me? Were all those meetings we held in the revival, he talked about me in his prayer to God, wondering if all those messages that he had interpreted did not hold out against reality? And he said, I got so frustrated with all that I'd read, I said, I'm going to disbelieve in God from this very night. And I was determined that from the next morning, I was not going to pray, going to act as if God did not exist. He said, in the morning when I awakened, the commanding officer assigned me to clean the latrines. And as I was cleaning those latrines, he said, Ravi, it's a horrible place in those prison camps. As I was emptying out those waste bins, suddenly I noticed a piece of paper that looked like it had English on it, even though it was so stained with human excrement. I'd seen English and wondered if I could pick that up somehow. He said, I washed it and took that piece of paper, put it into my hip pocket, and went back to my room. I could not open it up till the night, till my roommates were sound asleep. And he said, there in the darkness of the night under the mosquito net, I flashed my light on that little piece of paper, and here's what it said. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose, and the rest of Romans chapter 8. He said, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I said, God, here in this prison camp, on the first day in years when I was going to disbelieve in you, you have followed me with your love, with possibly the most precious verse that I needed. He said, I got so surprised at this that the next day I went to the commanding officer and said, do you mind if I clean the latrines again? And he said, I started to clean the latrines every day to find out that the commanding officer had years ago been given a Bible. He was tearing out one page at a time, using it as toilet paper every day. And he said, I was washing it, taking and completing the rest of the book of Romans and other parts of the Bible and reading it as my devotions every night. He said, finally, they released me from prison. He said, and I started to build a boat and to escape with about 52 others. One day, 4 Viet Cong came and grabbed me and said, Hien, somebody has told us you're trying to escape. Is that true? And he said, no, it's not true. They pressured him and he said, no, it's not true. He lied to them and they left him. Moments after they left him, Hien said, I wept alone in my room and I said, there I go again, God, trying to run my own life while you have followed me with your love for so long. He said, I prayed a prayer and hoped it would never be answered. I said, God, if you send those 4 men back to me again, I will tell them the truth. And it was only hours before, if not minutes before they were to set sail, these 4 men came, grabbed him by the collar, rammed him against a wall and said, we know you are trying to escape. Is that true? He said, I looked them in the eye and said, yes. What are you going to do, put me back in prison? They said, no, we want to go with you. And the 4 of the Viet Cong got on the boat with him. He said, Brother Ravi, we were swept on the high seas with wild storms. We would never have made it except for these 4 men and their skippering ability who brought us safely to Thailand. And ultimately, as the United States opened its door, he came to the United States, finished his degree at Berkeley. Now he's working as a businessman there. He came and visited us here in Atlanta and sat at our kitchen table with my children. And with the gentle